in Qumran, on the edge of the windswept Judean wilderness, near the northern tip of the Dead Sea, lived a community of Jews who had separated themselves from what they thought was the corrupt and defiled cities of the land in order to prepare themselves for the coming of the day of the Lord. These Essenes, as they were called, believed that the kingdom of God was imminent, at hand, and they were the ones to prepare a way in the wilderness for the coming of the Messiah. Some believe that John the Baptist himself might have been a part of this community. It was the Essenes who gave us the Dead Sea Scrolls, and among those ancient scrolls was one they called the War Scroll. This enigmatic scroll detailed for us how they believed the end of the world would come. There would be a great and protracted conflict between the sons of light on one hand and the sons of darkness on the other, between the amassed nations of the world and God's people. Decades of warring with different enemies near and far would take place before the final battle with the Kittim, the Romans. At that time, there would be a great tribulation unlike any that had gone before it. It would be a terrible and trying time indeed. As the battle wore on between the sons of light and the sons of darkness, there would come a moment when it would seem as if all hope was gone and the Romans would prevail. And it was at that very last moment that God himself would show up with his mighty hand and legions of angels to bring down the forces of Rome and deliver his people once and for all. Finally, the proper temple worship can be reinstated, and the 26 elders of the people would minister in their divisions. Shabbat Shalom. It is so good that you can join us again for this weekend as we begin a series on eschatology. Now, eschatology is the study of the last things, the end times if you like. And understandably, many people are very interested in this subject for a whole variety of reasons. The preceding account that we just heard about the Essenes and Qumran show us that this has been a matter of interest to people for many, many generations long before we came along, long before our generation. We are not the first ones to be interested in this. Specifically, what we just heard about the War Scroll is a very specific type of eschatological literature or genre known as the apocalyptic. It was in fact a very common type of exilic and post-exilic literature from that time. What is the apocalyptic? In literature, there are many different genres. For instance, you might have songs, you might have poetry, literal history, epics, parables, different types of writing. And truth can be conveyed in every genre. But it is important to know what kind of genre this is because it will help us to correctly read the literature and understand what it is supposed to convey. Help us to interpret it if you like. So for instance, if someone's told you, the hills are alive with the sound of music. Now, you might think that this is a very perplexing statement. I mean, how can the hills be alive? The hills are not alive. They are not living things. But how can the hills be alive, much less with the sound of music? You know, how can that be? I mean, I can imagine that winds might be blowing, whistling through the trees and forests, creating some sounds, but hills making music is unheard of. But then you realize, wait a minute, this was not meant to be taken literally. This is part of a song, the lyrics of the song. And what the author of those lyrics was trying to say was that there was, some kind of joy involved when they were singing and running on the pastures of the hills and open pastures. So there was some sort of truth, if you like, that the author was trying to convey to us. But that truth was not being conveyed in a literal sense. And if you want to insist on reading the hills are alive with the sound of music literally, you are going to end up one confused puppy. All right. So you realize that actually that there's this different genres that operate in non-literal ways. They are not meant to be taken literally. They are just part of different styles of communication. And for us as readers, it is therefore quite important for us to understand what type of genre this is, what are the features of this genre, so that we can not misread it, and we can correctly interpret what it's supposed to say. Right? Now, for a start, this is a very powerful genre, the apocalyptic literature. It's not just something that was designed to convey facts and information. As a matter of fact, it tries to capture our hopes and our fears. It's designed to do that. And it taps into our current realities and our current uncertainties in order to give us courage for the present life in the light of the final outcome. Another example of modern apocalyptic literature is actually Godzilla or Gojira. Now, I think many of us grew up watching, this monster movie, right? Godzilla, and at one time or another, one of the remakes. Now, this monster that rose out of the ocean to ravage humanity and wreak havoc and destruction. But did you know that Godzilla was supposed to represent something? There was an apocalyptic message in Godzilla. In the original story, in 1954, Godzilla was the product of nuclear radiation, and this was a metaphor of the destructiveness of nuclear weapons. This is a movie with a message, right? It's trying to convey something. Now, we might think of Godzilla as fiction that contains no truth, but if you understood what its intent and its design was, then you can see how Godzilla or Gojira is a reminder to us of the danger of nuclear power and nuclear weapons. So obviously, most people mistook Godzilla as pure fiction. But to the Japanese people in 1954, living in the aftermath of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, they easily understood the message of Godzilla. And people like us who do not have that context, we completely miss it, or we find it cryptic because we lack the contextual knowledge. So this is another example of why people misread apocalyptic literature. They either take it literally or they fail to capture the context and the meaning of it. Now, the same can be said about how Christians approach apocalyptic literature in the Bible, and they tend to focus on the wrong bits. So what should we focus on in the apocalyptic literature? Well, the apocalyptic is concerned with a few major things, right? It is concerned with which side are you on. There are always two sides in apocalyptic literature, right? This is how all the stories go. There's always the good side and the bad side, the light and the darkness, sons of light and sons of darkness. There's always, the whole world is basically divided into two. And the way you look at the situations in the world is that there's this conflict, this battle, great fight between good and evil. This is also known as dualism because it's two positions. There's no third position in between. You are either on this side or you're on that side. And this became prominent during the times of the exile and post-exilic Judaism. So this is probably something that arose in part because it was influenced by Persian worldviews. And you'll find that this is not the case in pre-exilic books. For instance, if you look in Genesis or Deuteronomy and Leviticus and all those earlier books, you don't really see this dualism. But from the exile onwards, you do see in a very strong sense that there was this dualistic division of the whole world between good and the bad, good and evil. Number two, the apocalyptic addresses incredible amounts of suffering and persecutions for those on the side of good usually, right? So it does so by attributing the pain and the suffering to that cosmic battle between good and evil rather than a personal sin, right? So why do we suffer? We suffer because we are being caught between this great battle and conflict between good and evil. So our job is to remain faithful no matter what the threat. It's very much like how the three friends of Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego did, right? So the king comes to threaten them about their faith, and they stuck to God. They held fast, and in the end, God delivered them. So that's very apocalyptic. Number three, the apocalyptic is always, tends to always end with a good ending, right? But not before a great tribulation. So the great tribulation represents whatever immediate cost that we have to pay in order to remain faithful to our God. So one thing is for sure, right? Right and good will ultimately prevail. So when there are injustices, there things will be made right. Eventually, God will come, judgment will be delivered, and everything will be made right in a sort of a cataclysmic manner, right? This is how we find courage for our struggle today because we know how it will all end. So this is exactly what we see in the war scrolls in Qumran. It was written in the context of deteriorating present conditions. When people look at the world around them, they think, oh, how terrible things are. How can this continue to go worse and worse? People are unfaithful to God, they are corrupt, they are terrible. So how can this situation continue? There must be something that's going to stop all of this deterioration. So it was written in the context of that kind of a worldview, a deteriorating worldview, and things were getting worse and worse, and the future looked bleak. It was written to help people make sense of the world, keep the faith, and to be ready for the end. This narrative is familiar because we find it in biblical post-exilic writings, right? For instance, you see this in the book of Daniel. Daniel talks a lot about the end. In the New Testament, you find that the book of Revelations is an example of apocalyptic work. In fact, the proper name for the book of Revelations, the word Revelations is the Greek apocalypsis, right? So it is the apocalypse of John. That's the proper name of the book of Revelations. It is, in fact, apocalyptic literature. Many people don't know this. So why are we so fascinated with how the world is going to end? I believe this comes down to a few main reasons. The chief one is this: we are all trying to make sense of the challenges of this life. We look around the world, we see the chaos, the riots in America, the riots in Europe, the protests in Europe. We see COVID-19, we see Ebola, we see the climate change, we see all these problems, and somewhere in the back of your mind, you're trying to make sense of what is going on and where are things headed? If we continue like this, how will things turn out? We want to make sense of the world. Secondly, we want to have some hope. When you look at all these things, you wonder, where am I going to hang on to? Where am I going to put my anchor in this swirling ocean of uncertainty? So we want to have some hope. So we want to know that our present effort and endurance will finally have a fruitful end, right? Lastly, for those who are in great distress, this is also a picture of escape. People are wondering, how am I going to survive this? How am I going to get out of this terrible situation? We want some escape, right? Some way of getting out of this. So these three dynamics shape almost all our thinking about how the world will end. Pretty much all of us want to know, how long will it be before we get there, right? It's the children in the car going to a holiday. They are enduring the cramped conditions in the car and they're asking their parents, are we there yet? So I guess, our interest in the end times and in eschatology is our collective way of saying to God, are we there yet, right? Where are we going? Are we there yet? And at the same time, I think that a lot of our aspirations of the end may be influenced by what we have been told about how the end would be. Like the disciples of Jesus, many of them thought that the end would be a time when they would reign. They're going to sit up on thrones and rule all of Israel together with Jesus. So, that's this fairy tale ending that they are looking forward to. In their mind, that becomes the final resolution of all the issues, the challenges of every level. For some people, the end is when I don't have to work so hard anymore. I don't have to suffer with sickness anymore. Many people invest their own aspirations and hope on the end. And all of these things come into why we are so interested in the end. Basically, for some people, this final day, this final reality, the day of the Lord, for them it is the fulfillment of their every desire and their longing, so to speak, right? So we've been given this picture that there's this grand pot of gold at the end of that proverbial rainbow. No wonder so many people are longing for that end. And you see that also in the Bible, in Amos, for instance. Others have been told that the end must be preceded by a great time of testing and tribulation. And as a result, we are all somewhat anxious. Are we going to have to go through that tribulation? Are we going to miss it? Would there be a rapture just before the really bad times start and we're going to all be whisked away into safety? So, some people have some degree of anxiety with regards to how that world will end if we will have what it takes to survive it faithfully, right? So a great debate has risen in the past about whether believers will be spared of this tribulation, right? Some people say it's pre-trib rapture, mid-trib rapture, post-trib rapture, and a few other positions in between. I always tell people, as long as we make it for the trip, all right? So, but for some, their hope is to be raptured, to be whisked away. This is the escape they are waiting for. Now, either ways, the nature of apocalyptic writing is such that many people will become very emotionally invested in that outcome. And as a result, it has the power to change our behavior. It has power to do some bad things too, but the positive side of it is it has the power to change and alter our behavior and our attitudes. In the weeks to come, we will touch and explore on different issues relating to this. But for today, what I like to do is to find out what Jesus himself had to say about how the world would end. One of the places where Jesus spoke the most about this is in Matthew chapter 24, the so-called second Sermon on the Mount. So let us see what Jesus had to say about the apocalyptic. Matthew chapter 24, Jesus makes a comment about how the temple will be destroyed. Chapter 24 verses 1 and 2. Then Jesus went out and departed from the temple, and his disciples came out to show him the buildings of the temple. And Jesus said to them, "Do you not see all these things? Assuredly, I say to you, not one stone shall be left here upon another that shall not be thrown down." So this temple, renovated by Herod, had just gone through decades of renovation. Right? Herod had already died, so the renovation ended after he died. And when it was done, it was just this magnificent building, beautiful, with all the columns and pillars. It's just something very impressive. And Jesus says, not one stone will be left on one another before this temple will be destroyed. So this caused the disciples to be very curious, right? So as they walk across the Kidron Valley to the other side, Mount Olives, not very far away, just a short walk, they go up Mount Olives, they sit down on Mount Olives and they look at the temple. You can see the temple from the Mount of Olives, right? In the full view of the temple. And this was when the disciples now comes up to Jesus with basically two questions. Matthew chapter 24 verse 3 says, "Now as he sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came up to him privately saying, 'Tell us, when will these things be? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?'" Right? So when will these things be? What will be the sign of your coming? So the first question was a reference to Jesus' earlier remark that not one stone of the temple will remain standing. Right? This newly renovated temple, how dare anyone suggest that the temple of God would be destroyed? This was the center of their spiritual universe. So to suggest that, this temple would be destroyed was just something completely shocking. So of course the disciples wanted to know what Jesus meant when he said that, such a terrible event would take place. And if it would, when would it take place? The second question is actually a little bit more interesting, right? It's asking, what will be the sign of your coming? But, actually at this point, Jesus had not yet informed the disciples or really revealed to the disciples that he was going to be taken away. He was going to be killed, crucified. They hadn't got it yet, right? So it's quite interesting that they are asking about his coming. What coming is this, right? And what is this end of the age? Unfortunately, we don't have time to get into this bit here. So we're going to just move on for now. This was how Jesus answered their questions, right? And pointing to three main things. First of all, Jesus, in his answer, first of all, beware of pretenders. Don't believe them when they say that the world is ending, basically. Matthew chapter 24 verses 4 to 5. Jesus answered and said to them, "Take heed that no one deceives you, for many will come in my name, saying, 'I am the Christ,' and will deceive many." Because you know what? This is what most of the false messiahs tended to do. They tended to say that the world is ending and they are here to wrap it all up. And you will hear many wars and rumors of wars, famines, pestilences, earthquakes. These things must be. In other words, these things do happen. They are part of life. They do not mean that the end is here. In fact, in Matthew chapter 24 verse 6, Jesus says, "But the end is not yet." Okay, so when you see these things, don't panic, don't get anxious. These things do not mean, including pestilences, right? Like COVID-19. That is not a sign of the end. When you see these things, the end is not yet, right? They're the beginning of sorrows. They are not the end. So Matthew chapter 24 verse 9, Jesus continues, "Then they will deliver you up to tribulation and kill you, and you will be hated by all nations for my name's sake." So number two, Jesus is saying that at some point, Christians will be persecuted. There will be a great tribulation and suffering for believers. People will be offended by your faith, and your faith will be tested. There will be a cost to be paid to remain faithful to God. And many will fall away, deceived either by false prophets or maybe out of fear they fall away. So Christians will be tested. They will be persecuted. Third thing Jesus says, "He who endures to the end will be saved." Matthew chapter 24, verse 13, right? He who endures to the end will be saved. And the gospel of the kingdom will be preached to the end of the world, and then the end will come. So there are quite a number of things that must happen. There's all this stuff that you see around you, wars and unrest and earthquakes and pestilences. And when you see all these things, not yet. These are just the beginning of sorrows, right? And then the next step is there will be a time of great testing, trial, and persecution, where we must individually be prepared to pay a cost for it. After all this is true, after all your personal suffering is done and you have endured to the end, and then the end will come, right? Of course, the gospel of the kingdom will have to be preached to the whole world, and then the end will come. Now, Matthew chapter 24, verses 15 to 22, Jesus basically makes an allusion, right? He makes a reference to something called the abomination of desolation spoken in the book of Daniel, right, by the prophet Daniel. Now, this is about how Antiochus IV Epiphanes desecrated the temple in 167 BC. That's more than 100 years before the time of Jesus. There was this emperor from Syria who desecrated he sacrificed a pig in the temple. So he desecrated the temple, he corrupted the temple. And this was what triggered the great Maccabean revolt that overthrew the Greeks and the Syrians. So if you knew your history, you have to know your history to know this, right? But every Jew of that day would have known this. They actually have a whole festival that commemorates this event. It's the festival of Hanukkah. The festival of Hanukkah commemorates when they finally defeated the Greeks and the Syrians and they reconsecrated the temple. So when Jesus talks about the abomination of desolation that was mentioned in the book of Daniel, actually, every one of his hearers knew exactly what he's talking about. He's talking about that event when they desecrated the temple. Now, what was that event? That was the triggering event, the event that triggered a great revolt. And that revolt was a time of great difficulty. There was fighting and killing for quite a number of years before, they finally succeeded. So Jesus was making a reference to that. And basically, what he was saying is that when you see an event like that triggers a great revolt, then you know, right? This time, if you can escape, do your best to escape. That's basically what Matthew chapter 24, verse 15 to 22 is about, right? This is a time of persecution, a time of tribulation that was coming. It will be triggered by some event like that. Matthew 24, verse 9. And it's interesting because you see, this triggering event, if you understand the allusion about abomination of desolation, requires the temple to be still there, right? Because it was a desecration of the temple that triggered this great war. Matthew chapter 24, verse 23 to 25. And then, if anyone says to you, look, here is the Christ, or there, do not believe it. For false Christs and false prophets will rise and show great signs and wonders to deceive, if possible, even the elect. See, I've told you beforehand. So again, Jesus is now going back to his earlier warning to tell us that there will be many pretenders, people wanting to deceive believers with various miracles and signs and wonders. He's warning us, don't fall for it. I'm telling you beforehand. I think Jesus will probably be a little bit exasperated. I just told you, why did you still fall for it? So don't fall for it, right? And finally, after the tribulation and testing, we will see some signs. And we find that in verses 29 to 31. Immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in heaven, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he will send his angels with a great sound of a trumpet, and they will gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. This is classic apocalyptic writing now. The sun, the moon, and the stars, they are not literally referring to the physical cosmic bodies, right? How can a star fall from heaven to earth? Literally, it just doesn't work, right? So this is not literal. This is an allusion to, again, if you knew the Bible, you know exactly what Jesus is talking about. This is an allusion to Isaiah, to Ezekiel, to Joel, who uses the same sort of language concerning the coming of God's judgment. For instance, in Joel chapter 2, verse 10 to 11, which is written in a poetic form. The earth quakes before them, the heavens tremble. The sun and the moon grow dark, the stars diminish their brightness. The Lord gives voice before his army, for his camp is very great. For strong is the one who executes his word. For the day of the Lord is great and very terrible, who can endure it? Again, in Isaiah chapter 13, verse 10 to 11. For the stars of heaven and their constellations will not give their light, for the sun will be darkened in its going forth, and the moon will not cause its light to shine. I will punish the world for its evil, and the wicked for their iniquity. I will halt the arrogance of the proud, and will lay low the haughtiness of the terrible. I think the moment Jesus begins to say those words, sun, moon, and stars, not giving their light, every Jew worth their salt would know that he was actually making an allusion. He was not describing literally things that will happen. He was making an allusion to earlier prophecies concerning the day of the Lord, the judgment, the coming judgment of the Lord. So the Jews who heard him knew this was what he's talking about. He's using allusions. He was using old prophetic language to describe an event. That event was the day of the Lord. So at this time, the Son of Man will come back on the clouds with power and glory. And again, they know this is what Jesus is talking about, the coming of the Messiah. Because this is a picture straight out of the book of Daniel that early on Jesus was referring to. In Daniel chapter 7, verse 13 to 14. I was watching in the night, and behold, one like the Son of Man coming with the clouds of heaven. He came to the Ancient of Days, and they brought him near before him. Then to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion which shall not pass away, and his kingdom the one which shall not be destroyed. So when Jesus talks about coming on the clouds, the Son of Man, everyone knew this is right out of Daniel. Of course, everyone except Christians, because very often we don't really read the Old Testament quite in the same way. So when we see these things, we tend to take it literally because we lack the biblical context of what was happening, right? So in other words, Jesus was saying that after a time of great suffering and testing, the end will finally come with God's judgment at hand. Now obviously, in order to get this, you would have to know all those allusions that we mentioned earlier. So the question we really want to ask now is this: what is this end that Jesus was referring to? What would it look like? Was he talking about the destruction of the temple, which happened in 70 AD? Or was he referring to a more final ending, futuristic ending? Well, in Matthew chapter 24, verse 34, Jesus gives us an interesting detail about the context for all of this. He says, "Assuredly I say to you, this generation will by no means pass away till all these things take place." So say a generation is about 40 years, by Old Testament accounting, and Jesus was saying this around 30 AD. It would mean that, literally this would be something that would happen before 70 AD. And as it turns out, the temple was in fact destroyed in 70 AD. A time of great conflict broke out in 66 AD. It was triggered by the Roman governor who went into the temple to plunder the treasury. So he goes into the holy place, he takes the gold, 17 talents of the gold, claiming that he's taking it for the emperor. And this just angered everyone. There was protests everywhere. And the governor, instead of listening to their protests, he crucified the protesters. He crucified those people who complained. And this triggered a great war known as the Jewish Revolt. This led to a 4-year war that ended in the complete destruction of the temple, not one stone left standing on the other. So Jesus accurately predicted this. He said that when you see something like the abomination of the desolation, right? Something that triggers this event, some desecration of the temple, you know that there's going to be a time of great war. If you can escape, try to escape. And some of them tried to escape. Some escaped into the wilderness in Masada, and actually they all died, right? With the exception of 1 or 2 people. So this answers the question about when the destruction of the temple would be. This generation would not pass away, right? But what of the coming of the Son of Man, which was really that second question? Jesus, almost as if he knew that we would be asking this question, now answers us in Matthew chapter 24, verse 36. But of that day and hour, no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, but my Father only. So just like no one knew when the flood would come in the days of Noah, none of us can know when the final end will come. However, the certainty here is that it will eventually come. Not simply as a history-ending event, but as a resolution to the injustice of the world, like the time in Noah. And the whole point of this message is therefore that we should be watchful and hopeful, right? So you don't know when it's coming. You don't want to become complacent like it was in the days of Noah. Rather, you want to be watchful and hopeful. Matthew chapter 24, verses 42 to 44. Watch, therefore, for you do not know what hour your Lord is coming. But know this, that if the master of the house had known what hour the thief would come, he would have watched and not allowed his house to be broken into. Therefore, you also be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour you do not expect. Watch, therefore. Let me end with this question. How can we be watchful? Should we buy more masks and toilet paper, right? Should we take out a more comprehensive insurance program? How exactly do we prepare for the end of everything? I want to suggest to you that there are two ways in which we can be prepared for that eventuality. You do so by making peace with your neighbor. Don't carry grudges and bitterness in your heart. Forgive and be forgiven. And you should do so promptly, because you never know when the end will come, right? So do so whenever you can, as soon as you can. Secondly, and perhaps more importantly, we should make peace with the returning King. This period of watching is not simply a passing of time before the bell rings. It represents an opportunity for us to set our accounts right with God. And the way we do this is by putting our faith in the Son of Man, in Jesus Christ. God's hand of reconciliation to us. If you have been waiting for the right time to surrender your life to Jesus Christ, wait no longer. For the end comes like a thief in the night when we least expect it. This season of great disruption could well be God's wake-up call for all of us. And you have an opportunity today to take a step of faith and open the door of your heart to the Lord who is knocking on your door this very instant. If this is your desire, I would like to pray for you and maybe ask you to pray with me. Lord Jesus Christ, I believe that you are the coming King. I want to ask that you will be my Lord and King. Forgive me for the sins of my past and help me to live in your righteousness and grace. Amen. If you have prayed this prayer, I'd like you to get in touch with us. Drop us a note in the email listed below, and we would like to help you to take more steps towards this. But for the rest of us, this is a time for us to be fruitful, to be watchful, to be purposeful. It is not a time for us to be fearful and to be discouraged. It is not a time for us to become anxious, because Jesus says when you see these things, it is not yet. But we should be watchful because he comes like a thief in the night. May God bless you richly as you prepare yourself, as you strengthen your hope and your faith in the Lord Jesus Christ.